Hey, Internet. That was a voice crack. Oh. Hey, Internet. My name is Jeff, and I'm a pastor, and on Wednesday nights recently, we have been going through each of the passages in the Bible that talk about homosexuality, and talking about different ways of understanding and interpreting these texts. And last night, I should probably say, this is part 2, so if you haven't seen part 1, then you should go back and watch part 1 before you watch part 2. Last night we talked about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. Before I read this passage and go any further, I just want to let you know that there will be some talk about sexual violence in this discussion, in this video, so if you're sensitive to that, then might be a good one to skip. Here is Genesis chapter 19, with that being said. 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered the house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you last night? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Probably goes without saying, but we do mean know in the biblical sense, since, this is the Bible after all. They don't mean they're gonna play icebreaker games and get to know each other. They mean something else. We continue. Lot went out of the door to the men and shut the door behind him. And he said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do with them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow has come here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse than you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door, and they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. And then, after this happens, in case you don't know the rest of the story, burning sulfur falls onto the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah as wrath and punishment for their sins, and Lot escapes with his wife and his 2 daughters, and his wife turns back, turns into a pillar of salt. As I'm running through this, I'm thinking, there are a lot of things that need some explanations here. The pillar of salt thing, the burning sulfur falling from the sky. We can get to this some other time. But this is just to say that Lot and his 2 daughters escape to a cave together, and we will eventually get to what happens to them. So, a couple of things about this passage. One is that this is a passage that is very often used in the debate about homosexuality because non-affirming people will say, oh, the sin of Sodom was that the men wanted to have sex with other men. And man-to-man sex is the sin of Sodom and why this city was destroyed. So people will often use this passage in order to make that argument against homosexuality, homosexual practice. A couple of things that we need to talk about before we really dive into this passage. And one is that in the ancient world, hospitality is highly, highly valued. If you look at ancient ethical codes, whether they be law codes or religious codes of varying religions, you're going to find that hospitality is something that's crucial in all of these. And it's because there were no hotel rooms and there were no Airbnbs for people to stay in. And so hospitality was important as people were passing through. You were supposed to show hospitality to travelers and aliens, as the text calls them. And we even find this in other parts of the Bible. So when you look through Leviticus, it'll tell you how to treat sojourners who are in your midst. So Hospitality, highly valued in the ancient world. Also, something that's worth mentioning is that people are very skeptical of outsiders. And this is because you don't necessarily know who these outsiders are or what you're planning. And so hospitality is important, but also people are a little skeptical of some of the people who you might be showing hospitality to, or who your neighbors might be showing hospitality to. So it's a little bit of a tense situation that we have going on here. Another thing that we should get into is that in the ancient world, males raping males, it wasn't necessarily about the sex act, but it was an act of domination and humiliation against your enemies. So the kind of sex that we're talking about here has a lot less to do with love, romance, expression of commitment, expression of love for another person that you have love for, and a lot more with showing dominance and humiliation to another person. Also, it's important to mention that this was a shame-honor culture. And what a shame-honor culture is basically honor is something that's a high commodity. Honor is something that you seek after, and you can lose the honor that you have by being shamed. And that shame is contagious. It can rub off onto other people, and if you get shamed and you lose some of your honor, that means that people aren't going to be associating with you as much, which means that you can lose your business. It means that your family can starve, all because you were shamed, or because somebody that you know, somebody that you're friends with, a family member was shamed. So this is why some cultures still practice shunning. Shunning isn't necessarily a punishment, it's an act of protection. So this is why Lot will say something like, "Please don't harm these two men who are staying with me. Don't do anything to them because they've sought protection under my roof." It's important to him to be an honorable person and continue to show honor to the people that he's giving hospitality to. And this is why he will eventually say something that makes not a whole lot of sense in our context, and it's actually pretty horrible, but given the context, it does make sense for him to say in a really icky, horrible way. It does make sense for him to say, "Don't do anything to these two men. Instead, take my two virgin daughters." Because remember, in the ancient world, women are property. And so he doesn't want to be shamed by having these two men who he's showing hospitality to be dishonored. So he's saying, "Here, take my property and do with them what you will." And the fact that they don't, again, kind of shows that this isn't necessarily about sex or romance or love, and instead it's about an act of domination to two people that the rest of the people in Sodom are probably skeptical of because they're sojourners. So, a question that we need to ask is, what exactly was the sin of Sodom? Why was Sodom destroyed? What was the act of wickedness that they committed that caused God to rain down burning sulfur on this city? Was it male sex? I personally don't think so, and the reason I don't think so is because I like to let the Bible interpret itself. And in the Bible, we have other references to Sodom that describe what exactly Sodom's sin was. So, I'm just going to run through a few of these. If you want to, then you can go to a website like BibleGateway.com and you can just do a search for Sodom and you can read all of the different passages that reference Sodom. There's more than a dozen of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to hit some of the highlights here. So in Deuteronomy chapter 29, you'll find that the sin of Sodom is idolatry. Not male sex, but idolatry. And then if you look at the first few chapters of the prophet Isaiah, you find that it's idolatry. Once again, idolatry is mentioned, and that the sin of Sodom is corrupt leaders who are leading people astray. You also find in Isaiah chapter 3, as those few chapters go on, that Isaiah will say that it's not just their sin, but the fact that they brag about their sin. The fact that they seem to revel in how evil and how wicked they are. When you get to Ezekiel chapter 16, this is where you find probably the most vivid description of what the sin of Sodom is. Ezekiel says that they are arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty, and they did detestable things before me. Now, you might be saying to yourself, aha, they did detestable things. See, there it is, right then and there. It's male-male sex. But Ezekiel seems pretty vivid with some of his language, and when you read through the prophet Ezekiel, he's a guy who doesn't shy away from saying some things in a really vivid way. As a sermon illustration, he cooks a meal using excrement as the fuel for the fire. So this isn't a guy who's afraid to really tell it like it is. So why would he hide what he's trying to say by saying detestable things? I guess you could make the interpretation, aha, there it is, he's talking about male-male sex, but I really don't think that he is, because I think that he would just say that. He's the kind of guy who would just say that, if that's what he meant. So those are some of the passages in the Old Testament that reference what the sin of Sodom is, and they seem to revolve around idolatry and not caring for the poor, which seems to make sense with this whole hospitality thing, right? Not caring for the poor, not caring for the sojourner. This seems to be the way that the prophets in Deuteronomy seem to be talking about the sin of Sodom. Let's talk about Sodom in the New Testament and how it talks about the sin of Sodom. Jesus references Sodom in Matthew 10 and in Luke 10. Now, these are interesting passages. Jesus is basically sending 70 of his disciples out to do some preaching and healing in his name. And as he's giving them instructions, he says, now, if you go to a city and they don't receive you, they don't show hospitality to you, then as you're leaving, shake the dust from your feet as a witness against them. So again, seems to be talking about hospitality there. Jesus seems to be talking about it in terms of hospitality, because eventually he'll go on to say that it'll be worse for them, for those cities, than it was for Sodom. So Jesus seems to be talking about the sin of Sodom as hospitality, or at least references Sodom while he's talking about hospitality. Now, I want to talk about another passage in the New Testament, because this is a very popular one, especially for non-affirming people when they're making an argument against homosexuality. This is Jude verse 7. Jude is just one chapter long, so Jude verse 7. In the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, it says, likewise Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in the same manner as they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural lust, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So people latch onto this passage. Some people latch onto this passage because it seems very clear in this passage, finally, that the sin of Sodom did actually have to do with sex, and in fact, unnatural sex or unnatural lust. Now, let's talk about a couple of the terms that Jude uses here. One is when he says sexual immorality, he uses the Greek word porneia. Porneia is just a sort of catch-all term for sexual immorality. It's not referring to anything in specific. It's just talking about sexual immorality in general. But this thing about unnatural lust, this is one that a lot of people will hold on to, and they'll say, aha, see, it's the unnatural kind of sex that that Sodom was judged for. But this term unnatural lust, it actually comes from two Greek words. One of them, unnatural, is the word heteros, which is kind of interesting as a prefix. And then the other one is the word for flesh, which is the word sarx. So it literally means something like other flesh or unusual flesh. And this could mean a couple of different things. One is that it could be that maybe finally we have this thing that says, aha, the sin of Sodom was in fact gay sex. But I'm not necessarily inclined to think that, because the entire biblical witness thus far has been, it's about something else. It's about idolatry. It's about not caring for the poor. And in particular, I think it's interesting that the Old Testament talks about the sin of Sodom as idolatry, and then you get over to this thing in Jude that's talking about unnatural flesh. because that word for flesh can also mean sacrifice. So it could be that when you look at this compound phrase of heteros and sarx, unnatural flesh, it could be talking about an unnatural sacrifice or a strange sacrifice being offered to God. It could very well be idolatry. Now look, as I've been saying throughout these videos, all 2 of them so far, you can completely disagree with me, but I actually think that that's a pretty good interpretation. Another thing to highlight is that if we're being literal here and we're talking about different flesh, heteros, sarx, then we're talking about different flesh. So wouldn't that be a condemnation of heterosexual sex and not homosexual sex? It's just kind of something to think about. And another reason why I don't really think that what Jude is getting at here is saying that it was male-male sex that was the problem with Sodom. Now, it came up last night. The question came up last night. Well, then why do we call it sodomy? Right? Why is it that we as a language and as a culture seem to be interpreting that it was in fact male-male sex because we call that sodomy? Well, sodomy is an ever-evolving term, and it's very difficult to figure out when it first comes up in the English language or in Latin. I'm gonna level with you. I spent a lot of time over the last week Googling sodomy, so if you look at my internet search history, it's a disaster. I'm on some watch list somewhere because of all the Googling that I've been doing about sodomy over the last week. But this is a term that's ever evolving, and it seems like when it was first being used in the 1100s and in the 1300s, it's a term that means any act of non-procreative sex. Any act, including sex without the intent of getting pregnant. So contraception would even fall under that. So if you look at sodomy in its earlier uses, I don't know, chances are that if you're watching this, and at least we can say, if you're watching this and you're sexually active, you have committed sodomy by the 1100s standards and the 1300s standards. And in fact, even up until recently, there are sodomy laws on the books in some states that talk about acts of non-procreative sex between males and females together, and they describe them as sodomy. So this isn't necessarily a term that's specifically descriptive of male-male sex, even nowadays, even in the English language. So saying that we have the English word sodomy and it describes male-male sex, therefore the sin of Sodom is male-male sex, it's not necessarily a good argument. It breaks down pretty quickly. Now, for the sake of a thought experiment, I want to wrap up this video by saying, what if this is about sex? What if it is male-male sex that's the sin of Sodom? If that is the case, I think we have some explaining to do. And here's what I mean by that. We have to reconcile why it's okay, apparently, for Lot to offer his 2 virgin daughters to be gang raped, his 2 young daughters to be gang raped, but it's not okay for men to have sex with each other. We have to reconcile that if we're going to say that the sin of Sodom is about male-male sex. Another thing that we have to reconcile is that later on, as we said before, Lot and his 2 daughters run away, they flee to a cave, and eventually they realize that they don't have a male heir. And so the 2 daughters say, oh, here's an idea. Let's get Dad really drunk one night, and let's get pregnant by our dad. And this doesn't seem to be judged as harshly as the male-male sex. So again, we have to reconcile, if in fact we do believe that the sin of Sodom is male-male sex, we have to say, okay, but then why is it okay for this non-consensual incest act to happen without burning sulfur falling from the sky? Right? We've got a lot of explaining to do if this is in fact about male-male sex. We also have to wonder, is the sex described in Genesis 19 the same kind of sex that 2 men or 2 women have when they're in a consenting, committed relationship with one another? Because what we have in Genesis 19 is gang rape. Or at least the men are trying to commit gang rape against these two individuals who are in their city. That's very different than the kind of sex that you find in a same-sex marriage. So look, we also have to reconcile, is this the same kind of thing that's happening? Are we comparing apples and apples here, or are we comparing apples and hunks of burning sulfur falling from the sky? Alright, so that's our discussion about Genesis chapter 19 and the sin of Sodom. I hope this was helpful for you. I've actually been getting some really good feedback about these, so as I said last week, click like and subscribe. I don't quite know what that means, but I hear YouTubers say it all the time, so click like and subscribe. Actually, I saw that maybe 3 people have liked the previous video, so thank you. In fact, that's what it looks like when that happens. Thank you so much for that, and we're going to continue to put out some of these videos week by week, and next week we will be talking about Leviticus. So get on the edge of your seats, folks. Yeah. Anyway, see you next week. Bye, everybody.